Welcome to the Geneva Graduate Institute in Connversation with podcast series.
I'm Yanina Welp, researcher at the Albert Hirschman Democracy Centre at the Graduate Institute, and today I have the pleasure of being with Professor Staffan Lindberg, Professor of Political Science at the University of Gothenburg and Director of the project The Varieties of Democracy. Professor Lindberg has been in Geneva to present the V-Dem report 2024 entitled Democracy, Winning and Losing at the Ballot. Welcome, Professor Lindberg.
Thanks for having me.
There is a huge concern on democratic backsliding, and in social science we know that data is very important to assess to what extent this is happening and the characteristics of this backsliding, or on the opposite, in other times, the processes of democratization. But of course, data is constructed, and you have an amazing project in which a big team of people is working, and I would like to mention some features of this team because I think it's a very original, in some ways, way of producing this data. You have 33 regional managers, 134 country coordinators, as well as 4,200 country experts born in 185 countries. This is an amazing number of people working in different places of the world. And I would like to ask you if this reflects just the necessity in terms of building such a database, or is also part of a conception on how collaborative science should be done?
Thank you. It was both, and maybe also a third reason for us to approach measuring democracy this way. When we started V-Dem, Varieties of Democracy, back in 2008-09, you can say, we were a group of concerned professors who thought that the existing measures of democracy were not good enough for a variety of reasons. And we set out to measure democracy the way we thought democracy should be measured. And that included, first of all, to measure this wide variety of indicators. In total now we have about 600 indicators in the data set. So they are very detailed. It's not asking how democratic is this country, right? It's asking if a journalist writes critically about the government, how likely is it that that journalist will be harassed or thrown into jail or killed, worst case. And in order to capture and get good data on all different areas of democracy, from the judiciary to civil society and media, to elections, political parties, go down the line. There are many areas, and in order to get good data on so many areas for all countries in the world, we needed a multitude of experts. And most of the experts are academic peers, right? 84% of the experts are academics, and most of them still active in the country that they provide data on. And that speaks to the second concern we had, which was that a lot of the things we need to know about democracy or the lack of democracy are not found in official sources. There are some things, how many political parties are in parliament, what does the law say about media freedom or banning of parties, what does the constitution say about the electoral system, and a variety of issues. You can get it from the factual source. But take media freedom. Even Belarus or Russia today have media freedom by law. The question is, to what extent does it exist in practice? So if you only look at sort of observables, the factual or observable data, countries like Belarus could look relatively democratic. But in practice, we know that there is no media freedom. But how do we know the level of freedoms and rights and the functioning of institutions in a society, how much there is of harassment of journalists or self-censorship in the media? Things like that. That's qualitative knowledge that is very difficult to have sitting in, as I do in Gothenburg, as other democracy measures do, is sitting in Washington, D.C. or something like that. So that required us to then recruit all these experts with deep qualitative knowledge, meaning most of them are scholars. You're from Argentina. Most of the coders for Argentina are scholars in Argentina working on, say, civil society and media, right? And have published on that and studied that for many years. They have an incredible wealth of knowledge, of qualitative knowledge, that then we ask them to help us quantify. So that was sort of the intuition we came with, that there are a lot of scholars out there in the world in all these 185 countries that know a lot more than we do. And we need to collaborate with them so that together all of us can contribute the knowledge we have about the countries we know best and the areas of democracy in that country we know the best. So there are sort of both substantial and methodological reasons to approach measuring democracy this way.
Yeah, and as you mentioned today in your presentation, in the event co-organized by the Albert Hirschman and the Geneva Policy Outlook, this data is available. If some students are following this podcast, it's important to know that all this is available in the website. And as a frequent user, I can say it's that very easy to use to access this data, to compare between countries, to look at the temporal series, and it's a very rich, I would say, source of information for researchers, but also for activists and for people interested in the different topics. You mentioned other indicators, and I would like to ask you, there are many, Freedom House, The Economist, International IDEA, what offers V-Dem that the others are not offering? Is a complementary approach, or there is a disagreement in some aspects or in the definition of democracy? Why you decided to develop V-Dem? You already said that you were unhappy, but unhappy because of what exactly?
Well, we were not satisfied with. At the time, it was mostly Freedom House and Bertelsmann Transformation Index, Economist Intelligence Unit on the one side, that were paid for by certain government or government institutions, mostly State Department, and when it comes to Freedom House, and then the only sort of more academic type measure, global measure of democracy that was there was Polity 4, which was funded by the CIA. And then we had a series of methodological disagreements with the way they went about it that we thought could introduce bias in different ways. And also fundamentally, they measured and still measure fairly narrow slices of what democracy is or ought to be. And only one version, one conception of democracy. V-Dem is V-Dem and not Dem, right? Varieties of democracy. So we went through that broad democratic theory literature, but also the practice of democracy in different countries of the world, and identified 5 main traditions in thinking about democracy, and what are the aspects that should be there for it to be democratic, in that, egalitarian democracy, participatory democracy, deliberative, electoral, and liberal. And so we set out to measure all of that, the full spectrum, but also measure it then with that in-depth qualitative knowledge about the specific aspects of those traditions of democracy that the others didn't do. And then International IDEA has come recently to the stage with their Global State of Democracy report and their measure. And that's different in the sense, it's a little bit more like Economist Intelligence Unit, in that IDEA don't collect any of this data themselves. It used to be about 70% of the data they use for their democracy index comes from us. So it's our data that they aggregate their way. And then they add some other data sources. Now I think they broaden it a bit so that it's a little bit less than 70%. But it's basically aggregating data that other people collect. And whereas Freedom House collect their own data. Polity has been defunded and is no longer updated. And that was, for the last years, basically Monty Marshall himself coding all countries in the world. One coder.
Yeah, I have many questions, and I now undecided on which one take first. But yeah, let's follow with the coders. As you may know for sure, there is a lot of sensitivity when one of your reports is published, particularly in countries which are liberal democracies and slowly downgraded, or are electoral democracies, and then it's a kind of internal fight, and the academic community, particularly in political science, normally is quite engaged in this debate. So I have 2-3 questions related to this point. One is, how do you deal with potential bias? For instance, if in a given country, let's take, I don't know, whatever, I don't want to mention any country now, but you have a country in which a new leader emerged, challenged the status quo, and then the academic community may be strongly against or in favor, and this can affect the valorations, the evaluations, because part of your data is quite subjective, as you said. So this is one part of the question. And the other part is, how do you deal, if you deal in any way, because maybe the answer is we don't care, with the uses of this data? And now I can provide an example. I remember in Spain, when Spain was, I think in 2002, maybe 22, slowly downgraded in academic freedom. And when was a huge debate in the country among the people who is in favor and against of the government, which also spoke about a misunderstanding of the indicator, because academic freedom means much more than what the government does, which is also part of the equation. So how do you deal with all these ideological dimensions that go around the coding and the interpretation of the data?
Yeah, there are several aspects to this, but we've sought to address issues of potential bias. This is one of the things that we worried a lot about, and still do. And so we set up a pretty demanding protocol for selection of experts and or qualification of experts to verify that they have this expertise on this country in these specific areas, whether it's elections and parties or legislature and something else. Or we have taken the issue of potential bias very seriously, and we have devised several strategies to deal with this. And there are different sources of bias. You talk about one that has to do with, if I interpret it correctly, sort of ideological bias, if you like. And so the first thing we did was to devise a protocol for qualification of experts, verifying that they are certified experts, they are published academically on this country and this area, and so on. So they have their requisite expertise. But also them working with regional managers and country coordinators, so academics that we had built up in the V-Dem network that would typically know something about these, and that they are, known to be respected, impartial observers that have high academic standards where we seek the truth, right? And we also verified or sought to verify that people who become experts do not have direct political affiliations. They are not known representatives of a political party. They have not filled functions in a political party and so on. Or they have not worked for a particular government in a high position, so that they are distant observers. So that's one part of the strategy. The other part of the strategy was to recruit from different institutions in a country. Because in some countries, we know that this university is left-wing, that university is right-wing, and so on and so forth. So then we spread out to get diversity of views and not bias in one direction. One way to deal with bias is to get bias from both ends, and then, they cancel out. And then get enough experts. So we have a minimum requirement for each indicator, for each country and each year. We should have 5 independent experts who are independent of each other. So that we have enough evaluations to build on and aggregate up. And by doing so, and doing it in an advanced Bayesian IRT model, item response theory model, it's possible to extract as much as possible of the signal and reduce the noise and bias as much as possible. So that's another layer in dealing with potential sources of bias.
Yeah, let me now move to the definition of democracy, the conception of democracy. And on that I have a kind of 2 ways. One is an historical perspective. Democracy, maybe for, ordinary people, let's say, living in Western democracies, is just something given, normal, and they are so used to that it looks like democracy was here forever. But from an historical point of view, we can see that democracy is something quite new, is in construction, is not as well defined in practice as in the books. And then to what extent, when we are looking, particularly from political science, at data on yearly basis, we are not missing like a more general picture and trends. I don't know if it's clear what I mean. I mean, we are getting a picture of how institutions particularly evolve and some basic fundamental rights, but then maybe we are missing other important trends on the drivers, on the configuration of a given political system or in political change, or what we can get from a source like V-Dem and what is out, because of course we can't cover everything with one indicator. And connecting this with this current discussion on the democratic backsliding.
Yeah, I mean, depending on what view a particular person has on what democracy is or ought to be, what we include in that concept, V-Dem's data may or may not capture that. What we do is that we have a very precise and a very precise, detailed definition of each of the models of democracy, and then an operationalization with specific indicators that measure different parts of that definition. So it's very theory-driven and concept-driven in that sense. And we have a universal standard, so it's the same definition and same benchmarks and so on for all countries and across time. And that means, for example, that United States, that often portray themselves as being a democracy forever, or at least since its founding, in our measure doesn't come out as a good democracy until around 1970. Fairly recent. And on par with almost Portugal, right, whose Carnation Revolution we are celebrating today on the 25th of April, the day we record this. That's important to recognize, and that's really important for academic purposes, right? That we need to have time series that measure the same thing over time and across space in a comparable fashion, right? And then people on the street, their ideas on what's included in this idea of democracy may change over years and times and between countries and all that. And that's fine, and we may not measure all of that, but that's also not the purpose of V-Dem.
Very good point. I mean, and of course, social science, we have many more disciplines, people working from different axes, and the idea is to complement different approaches. No one can deal with everything. Interesting you bring the case of the US becoming a democratic country in 1970, more or less. And it opens room to one of my last questions regarding political implications. We were talking till recently about democratic promotion. Now we are talking more about democratic protection. And in the case of the US, at the same time in which it was qualified the country as democratic, was promoting dictatorships in many areas of the world. But yeah, this is just the date I have to mention here. My question is about the implications of your report in terms of multilateralism, war and peace, protection of human rights. We have been talking a lot about that, but I would like to get it also for this conversation and for this podcast.
Yeah, I mean, there are many implications of this wave of autocratization that the world is currently in. So our data, it's in the report, it's been part of the last few years' reports that, somewhere around, say, the year 2000 or so, the last 20, 25 years, the world has been in a wave. Some call it democratic backsliding. We talk about autocratization as the opposite to democratization. And it's important to recognize that we have data going back to 1900 for all countries in the world, basically. And in our data, there's never been a period since 1900 with so many countries autocratizing at the same time as now. Never been a period before with such a large share of countries autocratizing at the same time. The number of countries in the world has changed. There's never been so many people or such a great share of the world population living in countries that are autocratizing at the same time. No matter how we slice this data, we are in the worst international environment in terms of backsliding that we have ever recorded. At the same time, the world as a whole is still more democratic now than it was in 1973, before the Carnation Revolution in Portugal. So we are, in more absolute terms, we are still better off than we were before that third wave of democratization started. But it's going in the wrong direction at a record pace, at a record.
And we already have more wars.
Yes, and this will have many implications. One of them is that we know that this will lead to more wars, both interstate war and domestic militarized conflict. The science on that is very, very clear, right? The good sort of high quality democracies don't fight wars with each other. They also have much less of violent conflict. Why is that? Because democracy is, as we sometimes talk about it, the peaceful resolution of conflict, right? We have conflicts, but we with elections and civil society and demonstrations and all these channels for voicing those disagreements and handle that conflict and resolve it. And populations and leaders of democratic countries, because of freedom of information and mobilization and the role of elections in channeling those preferences, don't like to go to war, especially not with other democratic countries. We know internationally we can find other ways to deal with conflicts between countries than go to war. So fewer democracies, especially fewer sort of high-quality democracies, will mean that there are, just pure mathematically, there are more countries that can start wars with each other and will.
Yeah, and at the same time, I guess that there are dimensions which go over the domestic politics and the institutions. I'm thinking now in criminal governance, which is a huge problem, in increasing problem in many areas of the world. And some new research from Latin America is showing that the state capacities and the level of democracy are not good enough to prevent the development of this kind of criminal governance. This is happening also in countries such as Uruguay or Chile. So it's also this idea that there are some dimensions that go really beyond the institutional dimension.
Oh yeah, definitely. Democracy, we should also be clear about that. Democracy does not mean that we necessarily get utopia in any one country. It is a process of governing a country hopefully towards something better for people in general. But doesn't mean that any country at all points in time can deal perfectly with problems and challenges in society. Of course not. And there are some areas where some countries in certain periods for various reasons fail terribly, right? With drug trade or things like that. And opinions change over time in democracies, right? So that will then get expressed in what leaders are selected and elected into office and pursue policy. So yeah, definitely. We should not have unrealistic expectations of democracy and portray democracy as something that is utopian and wonderful all the time, because it's not.
Absolutely. Good point. I think also it's not possible to expect that an institution or whatever solution will be magic and resolve the problems forever, because it never happens, as we know, particularly from experiences such as the demonstrations in Iceland or in Chile, where all this focus on citizens' participation at the end didn't provide the expected outcomes. I have a very final question, because we are organizing a podcast series who is voting in 2024. We are looking at elections in this special year in which many countries in the world will go to the polls, many people in the world. And my question is very specific. It's about the US. What do you expect from the results in the elections in the US and the consequences for democracy in the country and in the world, I would say?
I'm very worried. I'm not alone with being very worried about the United States. Our colleagues, political science professors in the US, across the board almost, are very worried. I think whether Trump wins or loses that election, the risk for civil disturbances, violence, even some low-scale, low-intensity type civil conflict. Some have used the word civil war, but that may be taking it too far. But I think the risk is very high. We saw that after the last election with the insurrection and the Capitol Hill event and all that. And by all indications, they are much more prepared, much more organized today. And that can result in a lot of violence, regardless of whether Trump, if he wins, suppressing other opinions and other groups, and all this talk about, I mean, Trump has even used the language of immigrants is a threat to our bloodline and all that sort of rhetoric that reminds about the 1930s. So there's that. And of course, protests and demonstrations against Trump and his politics if he wins, that is then met by violence, which we also saw last time after the elections, and that can become much worse. And then we don't know how the security agencies at different levels of the American federal system will deal with that, right? And worst case, confront each other. And if Trump loses, then by all accounts, also from the last election, even more so now, 68% by the last Pew poll I saw of GOP supporters still think that the elections were stolen last time, and that they're not going to accept this time. They're not going to accept that Trump loses. And that could lead to a lot of violence. Now, in addition to that, I'm on record with American news media and other places to say that if Trump wins that election, I do not think that democracy in the United States can survive that. And again, it's based on what he did last term in office, which were a lot of efforts at, for example, suppressing the media, suppressing opposition, get state agencies and the court system to work in his favor and according to his will rather than follow the rule of law and so on. It's also based on a plethora of statements that he's made on the campaign trail. Everything from things like that the Justice Department will be cleaned out of oppositional sort of voices or people who are doing their job, and be more like his private law firm and use it to prosecute and pursue political opponents, to closing down the FBI because they are investigating him. And he's gone as far as to call Democrats vermin. That's awfully close to the language used in Germany in the 1930s. It's very close to the language used in Rwanda in 1994. There are so many signs of what the authoritarian inclinations in intentions that Trump and the people around him have. And I think we should take that seriously. We should take politicians seriously on their word. And I don't think democracy can survive that. And we'll see what the federal system, if those institutions can fight back, how much of the judiciary would stand up, what would the sort of police and other security agencies do, we don't know. But there's a high probability that in whether Trump wins or not, it's going to be really messy after the next elections. And it's really worrying, of course, with the US and the current political situation, the backing of Ukraine, its role in NATO, its role in so many multilateral organizations on the international scene. So the ramifications are for the whole world.
Yeah, clearly. Yeah, well, with this quite pessimistic note, I think we will close this conversation. As you said, we have to take politicians seriously, but also politics seriously. I think in academia we also have a responsibility, we all, and we have to take this very seriously. I thank you a lot for coming to Geneva, for presenting the report and sharing with us your thoughts.
Thanks for having me.
For more information about the Institute, please visit graduateinstitute.ch. Thanks for listening.